Magnus Carlsen takes on Praggnanandhaa in their second classical game. The first one ended in Praggnanandhaa's favor. This is round 8 of Norway Chess 2024 and off we go. Magnus has the white pieces this time and opens the game with 1 e4. Praggnanandhaa now quite focused and goes very solid with e5. Magnus had chosen the Sicilian against Pragg, which had turned into quite a nightmare for the world number 1. This time he's going for the very solid knight f3, and it'll be interesting to see if Pragg goes for the Petrov with knight f6. No, he goes knight to c6, and Magnus goes for the Ruy Lopez. So generally we see the Italian or the Ruy Lopez. This time the bishop goes one step further and we have the Ruy Lopez. A6 played, and now Magnus just simply gets his bishop back to a4. Pragg brings his knight out to f6. This is the main line, and you have many different ways to play, but the main line is short castles here, and that is exactly what Magnus does. He castles here, and Pragg can go bishop e7, the closed Ruy Lopez. He can go b5 followed by bishop c5, which is the archangels. He goes for the open Ruy Lopez with knight takes e4, a very sharp line that leads to very theoretical positions. d4 played. Now very important not to take this pawn, because after rook e1 the knight will be pinned badly. So b5 played here, pushing the bishop back, and then you play the pawn in the center with d5. So the knight is very solidly placed. D takes e5 played, and now the bishop is attacking the pawn. So you defend it with bishop e6. Queen goes to e2. The queen now makes way for the rook. This is not the main line. The main line is knight d2 or bishop e3 or c3, but queen e2 was played here and bishop e7. The idea of queen e2 is of course to quickly get your rook to d1 and put more pressure on d5, which is exactly what Magnus does. But for the time being the d5 pawn is well protected and Pragg can actually castle it out. Yes, he castles, and here there's a very interesting line that starts with c4 takes bishop c4, but Magnus goes for c3. This is relatively lesser played move, and that's why Magnus plays it and gets off from the board. f5 played by Pragg after some thought, and now the knight is very strongly positioned in the center, so en passant becomes the natural way to play. He takes, and you can see Magnus is still in his preparation. It's a little bit of a worrying sign for Pragg that his opponent is well prepared. Bishop takes f6 played, and now Magnus brings his knight out. No, he's just waiting. Brings his knight out to d2. So taking on d2 would be a big mistake because the bishop is hanging on e6, and you need to do something about this knight. So Pragg rightly plays his knight to c5, putting pressure on b3, but more importantly defending his bishop. Magnus saves his bishop, goes bishop c2, and of course there can be all sorts of ideas with b4 trying to dislodge the knight. So rook e8 makes a lot of sense. The bishop is defended and the queen is attacked here. There can be some discovered attacks. Knight f1, Magnus is very confident about the position, just plays his knight to f1. How is Pragg going to continue? One idea is to go bishop g4, but white does have bishop e3 or knight e3 in the position. Instead, Pragg goes very, very solid with bishop f7. So he attacks the queen, keeps the pawn defended here. Magnus quickly brings his bishop out to e3 and presses the clock. Pragg's knight could be hanging in some lines, when the queen moves away. So perhaps moving the knight makes sense. He brings his knight to the center of the board on e4. If you take the knight, I'm going to take back with the rook and have a very solid position. Magnus now thinking carefully and goes knight to g3. He's putting pressure on the e4 square here. A good way to continue could be to move the knight backwards, but Pragg takes the knight on g3 and Magnus takes back, h takes g3 here. White's position does look slightly preferable here, but Pragg is very confidently exchanging the pieces. He goes knight to e5 and Magnus takes it. And black plays bishop takes e5. You can see that somehow the black position is slightly weakened here on the queen side. So while black is very well placed in the center with the two bishops and rook, Magnus tries to take advantage of this small weakening with the move a4. And his plan is to take and attack the b5 pawn. So clearly Pragg has to go c6. So this structure for black looks very solid. But Magnus now plays his queen to d2. And what could be his idea? One idea could be to play bishop d4, trade these bishops, and then have a slightly better bishop than his opponent. Pragg brings his queen to d6. Well, he doesn't really have a threat as such. He just improved his bishop, connected his rooks, and overall good move that has been played here. Magnus brings his rook to the e file. There's much more action happening on the e file than on the d file. So he brings his rook on e1. And now Pragg, what is he planning to do? He goes bishop g6. I like this move because he wants to trade these bishops. You can keep these bishops with bishop d1 with the idea of bishop f3, and I think that would have been a very, very powerful move. But Magnus chops off the bishop, and by chopping off the bishops, now queen takes g6. Most likely Pragg is going to take with the queen. You can see that the bishop for black is now quite good. So in effect, I think Magnus needs to trade this bishop as well. But then when he trades, we are going into a major piece endgame where it doesn't seem that white has anything to play with. Pragg takes the bishop. Magnus must take back with the queen. Taking with the pawn seems a little bit incorrect because the pawn would be isolated. So takes with the queen. And now this queen can hassle the c and a pawns a bit by trying to move in. He takes on a4. He takes the pawn. And now Magnus... This is a very, very interesting decision by Pragg, because in a way he's telling his opponent that it doesn't matter to me that I have a weak pawn on a6, because I'm going to try and... You can see Pragg is ready with his move. Push c5. Because now these central pawns will create a passer. And if you, by the way, manage to take here rook e8. So he goes back, goes queen d7. But just so that if you take here, then queen takes e8 is completely fine for black. As after take, rook e6, there is check and rook e2, and black is equal. So queen d7 played, attacking the d5 pawn. The rook comes in. So if you take now here with the check, I take back with the queen. Queen goes to c7, attacking the pawn on c5. And now Pragg can defend it with rook c8 perhaps. But he does the right thing. He goes for counterplay. d4. If you take the pawn with your queen, I have d3. d2 is coming in. It can get very dangerous. So Magnus takes the pawn on d4. C takes d4. And pawn takes on d4. So now this d pawn can become a real nuisance for Magnus. He plays queen back to c4 with a check. And with this, he's actually attacking the a6 pawn as well. So king h8 played, but taking the a6 pawn is not easy, because if you take here, I'm going to take queen takes e8. He takes, by the way, he takes it. Rook e8. Is rook e8, rook e8, maybe there is queen d4 and white has just won a pawn. So queen e8 makes a lot more sense. And now if you go and snatch this pawn on a6, then d3, d2 with the idea of queen e1 is very dangerous. So he plays rook d1. He's attacking d4 and also a6. How is Pragg going to defend both of them? He says, I don't need to. I'll go queen d7. Magnus now takes the pawn on a6. He's a pawn up. Pragg's pawn moves one step further. Look at Pragg's intensity while making this move. He feels like he could have some chance here. b4. And now let's push the pawn even one step further with d2. No, first back rank has to be sorted. That's good decision. Magnus brings his queen back to c4. 25 minutes for Pragg, 29 for Magnus. We are on move number 35. d2 played. Time is not such an important factor in this game. What is more important is whether Magnus can make good of his extra pawn here. He goes queen d3 and offers a trade of queen. I think what Pragg has understood is that after queen trade, he wants to quickly get rid of, by the way, Magnus takes, rook takes, and he wants to get rid of the b pawn for the d pawn, and then the resulting position would be 3 pawns for white versus 2 pawns for black. So king h7 played by Pragg, and king comes up to f2. So slowly Magnus is coming close to the pawn, and Pragg goes rook to b3. He takes, rook takes. Now Magnus is a pawn up. We are on move number 40, but this is a theoretical draw. Let's see how Magnus plays this position and tries to play for something here. First a check. King comes back to g1. And now how is Pragg going to place his pawns and pieces? He goes rook to b7. I think Magnus will go g4. He first goes king h2, improving the position of his king. Pragg plays pawn to g6. So now he wants to push his pawn to h5. And Magnus calmly brings his king up. Maybe he wants Pragg to play h5. Pragg does play h5. And can we go like king h4, king g5? Well, it seems like there's nothing much there. So Magnus plays g4. Pawn takes pawn. King takes g4. Now it's pure 2 versus 1. Now what happens in such positions generally is that white trades down further. You know, it becomes 1 pawn versus no pawn. And in that position, we very quickly get the Lucena position. Sorry, Philidor position, not Lucena. You get the Philidor position with the 6th rank cutoff. So we'll see that in action. First a check. Magnus pushes his pawn forward. Pragg attacks the pawn again. I think Magnus will just push the pawn 1 square forward. No, he brings his king back. King h3 played. And now rook b4. So Pragg is just hassling the pawns of Magnus. Magnus now defends it calmly. And he brings his king back to g7. king comes up to h4. So if, magically white can get the king to g5 and rook check here, that would mean that black is busted. But you see, Pragg waits and first a check. But if you had gone king g5, Pragg would have just gone back with his rook to c7. So first check, king f6 played, and now king to g4 played by Magnus. Pragg now goes to c3. He's attacking the pawn on g3 now. It'll be interesting to see how Magnus continues. He brings his rook backwards. Rook to b3. Pragg is waiting here. Magnus goes king h3. I think at some point Magnus will have to push his pawns forward. And right now you cannot push, so Pragg waits on the third rank. The moment I believe Magnus goes king h4, Pragg will attack on the fourth rank. Now rook e5 played. Pragg plays his rook to c2. He's cutting the king off this side. Now g4 comes up on the board. And maybe the idea is to push g5. Check. King comes to g2. It was also possible to go to h4, but after rook f3 maybe it was not so simple. So king g2, rook a3, king f2. And now the king comes to f7. Rook comes back, offering a trade of rooks. Rook a1. Staying active, rook b3. So Magnus is made a little bit of progress with his two pawns here. Pragg has remained active with his rook and kept his king on g7. King comes up to g3. And where is Pragg going with his rook? Well, he goes rook f1. Very interesting. So now if king h4, the f4 pawn falls. Goes check. And king g8. Safe move. Because if you came up, there were some chances of g5 and it becoming very dangerous. So rook a7, waiting. King f8, he also waits. So there is no real way for white to make progress here. And you can see Magnus looking at the other positions on the big screen. And now he plays his rook to a4 once again, hoping to come in with his king to g5. Pragg goes rook h1. King f3. Rook g1. And pawn pushes forward to g5. Very interesting. Finally, Magnus has made some progress. Check. And now his aim is to get with his king into f6. That is his next aim. He gets one step closer, king e4. But I believe Pragg is going to give another check here. No, not really. He wants to move his king up. He brings his king to g7. In comes a check. King comes back to g8, and now king e5 looks like a great move, because with king e5 he plays it. Now if you give a check, I think it's trouble time, king f6. So that's the reason why Pragg waits, rook f2, and his point is if Magnus goes to f6, he will take this with a check. And Magnus anyway goes in, and he says to Pragg, take my pawn. Magnus takes on, Pragg takes on f4. Magnus will take the pawn on g6, and it looks like the position is dangerous. But now remember that if you have a knight pawn, passive defense works. So this is something to know. Rook f8, good move. Rook g7 check, king h8, and now there's no way to win this position, even though black rook is passively defending. If it was a bishop pawn, it would have won here, this position, but not with the knight pawn. With the bishop pawn, essentially you could go check and then have enough space, but with the knight pawn there isn't enough space. So both the players repeat some moves, and I think Magnus now will just agree to a draw, because there is nothing much to play for here. Yes, he accepts a draw. Praggnanandhaa manages to hold his own against the world number 1. A very good defensive effort by him. Magnus tried his level best to squeeze the water out of stone against Pragg, but it was not to be. With this, Pragg scores 1 win and 1 draw in classical chess with Magnus at Norway Chess, and next it will move into the Armageddon territory to see who manages to win this match.